So it's not for kids.
Want to talk about Zelda?
Is there Zelda news?
It's Zelda, but you play as a girl.
What the hell? You actually get to play as Zelda this time? I did see ads for that on Instagram.
This Zelda game is like Wingspan is to Wormspan. I don't know. That's
what? Wingspan to Wormspan?
It's probably a scuffed analogy. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it feels like the same kind of game, but it's like so different than what I anticipated. I thought it was just going to be a Zelda game with slightly different mechanics. It's very much a branch off in another direction, which I'm actually very happy about.
It's finally the third game where you get to play as Zelda. The first two being, of course, Wand of Gamelon and Zelda's Adventure, I think it was called, on the Philips CDI.
Yeah.
So
a game where you can play as Zelda on a major console.
What I'm wondering is, when are they going to make Metroid where you actually play as the Metroid, though?
When are they going to make Halo where you actually get to play as the Halo?
Now that would be something, actually.
I've been like genuinely enjoying it. Do I think it's the best Zelda game ever? No, because they're all very, very good, but it's on par with a lot of them. And so,
what is the best Zelda game ever? The fans want to know.
I don't know. Triforce Heroes. Welcome to Shelf Stable, a podcast celebrating board games that have stood the test of time. I'm your host, Kenny Katayama.
That's right, Kenny. We don't just talk about video games on this podcast. I'm your co-host, Tom Bowers. Today, we're going to be talking about board games, old-ass board games, and one major theme today, board game glow-ups. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about just some of the stuff we've been playing.
Yeah, so I got to play Puerto Rico from 2002. This is designer Andreas Seyfarth, and this version was published by Alea Games. Does it stand the test of time, and is the gameplay good? Kind of. This is my first time playing Puerto Rico. I've played many games of Race for the Galaxy. And from what I understand, Race for the Galaxy's roots came from Puerto Rico. From what I also understand, Puerto Rico was #1 game of all time for a while on Board Game Geek. And as we all know, the Board Game Geek rankings are very important. In this game, you are picking actions and then everyone else around the table gets to do the actions. In this game, you are colonizing Puerto Rico by setting up plantations and producing goods that are then traded. The different things you can do is make money, put workers on your buildings, build new buildings that give you access to different powers, or create goods, and then lastly ship those goods out for points. It was a very breezy game. Like, I felt like it went around the table at a smooth and kind of consistent pace, but it was also considerably longer than I thought it would be. And maybe that's because I went into it with my plays of Race for the Galaxy. Race for the Galaxy, when you're playing with people who know what they're doing, I mean, this is like a 15-minute game.
You finished at around the same time that it took us to play both like River Something Glassworks and Railroad Inc., I think. So it was like we had played two relatively short games, if I remember correctly.
So yeah, I think altogether with the teach, I think it was like an hour and 20 minutes or something like that. I'm sure it would go a lot faster if we knew what we were doing. I was impressed at the cool little things that you can do here and there to mess up others. You can plan a turn ahead of time so that you can ship out a good and nobody else can ship a good because of all the boats being full of goods. I have thoughts about the theme and about some of the components, which are definitely not original thoughts, but I'm going to hold off on them for when we do the main topic. That was Puerto Rico. Honestly, a little bit forgettable, but you know, it was a good game. I can see why people like it so much. It just didn't really hit hard for me for some reason.
The first game I want to talk about is It's a Wonderful World. This one published in 2019, designed by Frederic, Guerard, published by Les Boîtes de Jeux and OriGames, I think, as well. This is Seven Wonders on crack. most people in our group felt this is like Seven Wonders for gamers, or like Seven Wonders 2 Electric Boogaloo. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's a card drafting game and a sort of a civilization engine building game. Each turn, you're just grabbing a card and then passing the rest of the cards in your hand to the player on your left or your right. And with the 7 cards that you've accumulated after passing everything that you start with around the table, you need to make the best use out of those cards and decide which sort of enterprises you're going to undertake, which industries you're going to invest in. And so what makes it interesting is that there's basically like 5 different colors of cubes that you can invest in. You've got gray, black, piss yellow, blue, and green. And they also like generate themselves in a set order. So you can actually sort of try and set up mini sequences where you generate enough cubes in the first, like the gray phase, that those cubes get to build the machines that are going to generate black cubes in the second phase. If you're into this type of game, if you're into the tactical elements of drafting and you enjoy watching things sort of accumulate and snowball, and at the same time, this game is delightfully short. Just really feels extremely brief and snappy. It just kind of has everything going for it. I don't know why I haven't asked to get this on the table more often.
I'm really glad that you enjoyed it so much. I guess the first few times you played it, you enjoyed it, but it didn't really stand out or anything. But this time it felt like the gears were turning and you were really like, man, I've been sleeping on this game. Kind of like that's almost the vibe I got. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I really don't know what hit differently about this session. I think it's kind of just thinking about games more and really appreciating certain aspects such as brevity and short turns, in particular simultaneous turns, technically the way that this operates. Seeing all those things executed so well in a game that really feels like it rewards you for actually thinking things through a little bit and then trying to chain things together in a puzzly way. I don't know, it just somehow it fell into place and I was just like, dang, this is a really good one.
I really enjoyed Wonderful World as well. I find that it keeps me in that flow state where I'm just constantly churning and thinking about numbers and how to do well in the game, like for the entirety of the game. And then 40 minutes later, it's over and you feel like you are coming out of like a dazed state because you were just constantly thinking.
Yeah, if you've ever wondered what it's like to be in one of those montages from Sherlock where he's like piecing everything together, that's what that game is like.
That's A Wonderful World by Frederic Guerard. I played Circus Flohcati. Now get this, Tom. This one's from 1998.
Whoa, that is old.
This is by the good doctor Reiner Knizia. This version was published by Playte and Popcorn Games. Circus Flohcati is definitely a filler card game. Plays very quickly, and in the vein of a lot of Knizia filler card games, it's got like 3 rules, and then you're like, okay, this seems really straightforward, and then you start playing it, and you're like, wow, there's a lot of things to think about here. In Circus Flohcati, you are pushing your luck to try and collect the highest numbers in a series of colors. To determine what card you pick, you look at the cards that are out on the board, and you pick one of them and you put it in your hand. I know, real crazy stuff. But if you don't like any of the cards that are out there, you say, hit me, and then you deal another card from the deck. The catch is that if there's ever 2 cards of the same color out when you do hit me, you pass your turn. You've busted. You just don't get to take a new card for that round. And that's pretty much the game. I'm definitely skipping a few extra rules here and there, but at the end of the day, the core of the game is, do I settle for whatever's out there or do I risk it to get a higher number? And yeah, you can do things where you can get 3 of the same number. So even if you take 3 zeros, for example, they'll be worth points at the end of the game. The fun in this game comes from, I guess, a through line in our podcast, Tom, which is the I'm not afraid, I can keep going. It seems like we really gravitate to those games, or at least those are ones that we talk about quite a bit on the podcast. Every time it got to my turn, I would go, I'm not scared. And then the moment I said that, I would flip over a color that matched on the board. It was almost comical. Like everybody was like staring at me being like, don't say it. Because if you say it right now, the color is going to match something on the board, even if there's only one card out there. And then I would look at them all indignantly and just be like, I'm not scared. And then flip over the same damn color that's already on the board.
Yeah, there's literally only like one other color out, and you say it, you're like, it's like, I can't possibly be scared of this.
Yeah. I think Reiner Knizia games have that magic that allow you to not really care about what the heck happens until the very end of the game, when you all of a sudden realize that you're playing a game and then get back into them, where they're almost whimsical until they become deeply strategic. And that's how I felt when I was playing Circus Flohcati.
It sounds like it's similar to, like you said, that stuff we have talked about. Push Your Luck just has something so funny about it. Like, and I think it's because like you and I are a little bit narcissistic. We have big egos and we like to be the star of the show sometimes when it suits us. And then letting ourselves like get owned is like funny for everyone who knows us, because it's like, finally these guys take an L in a big public way. And then it's fun for us because it's just a game, guys. Copium. Yeah,
we've built so much of our identities around being the absolute best gamers.
Yeah.
And so it's just really humbling and really a great experience to let all those peons beat us in a child's card game, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Don't worry, we'll get them back when we play Terraforming Mars or something.
That was Circus Flohcati by Reiner Knizia.
All right, this last one I want to talk about from 2019. So I'm talking about Nine Tiles Panic. This was designed by Jean Merkl and Jean-Claude Pellin, published by Oink Games in a little box. This is a really fun filler game where you're trying to arrange these 9 tiles as quickly as possible in order to fulfill certain conditions. And these tiles have really cute illustrations of aliens landing on our planet and trying to eat as many burgers as they can while being chased by federal agents. You're trying to align the burgers, and there are roads that you're trying to get linked up, and you're trying to line things up in a way where like a ghost is eating as many burgers as possible, as in he's facing the same direction on a road as, you know, there are burgers, but without having an agent show up on that road. But you're also trying to counterbalance that by having as many dogs as possible. But you're also trying to counterbalance that by having as many houses as possible. So there's like all these things you have to consider in, you know, a set of tiles that are fundamentally really simple. You know, you're not necessarily going to score the best if you simply finish first. Finishing first really just acts as a tiebreaker whenever anybody is equal. It is one of those games that has a dexterity, like in speed element. So there are some people I think are going to be rightfully kind of turned off by this. But it's not one of those games where you're like grabbing for the same thing at the center of the table, or trying to make things fall over, or like having to do, you know, handstands. I don't typically enjoy games in this vein where it's like a fast-paced, like quick movement type thing. If I'm coming out to play games, like I like to play games fast, but I don't want to be forced to have to move my arms around as quick as possible. There's just something that's not super enjoyable about that most of the time. But this one's like kind of an exception, and I think it's because the tiles are so quaint. There's not really that much that you have to puzzle out, and everything's just kind of like right in front of you. There's no pile that you're reaching into the middle for and competing against the other players in a physical way, say like in Galaxy Trucker or something like that. Really fun. I think most kids would like it. It might be just a little too rules heady for anyone under the age of like 10.
I think quaint is a good word for this game. It has that undeniable Oink charm. One of the things I love the most is that you've got ghosts, you've got aliens, and then they're trying to eat hamburgers for some reason. And I don't know why that delights me so much, but yeah, the hamburger part is really the part I'm just like, oh, this is such a nice touch.
I think it's just one of those like millennial things, maybe. Like Ickin has cheeseburger has just rotted our brains so severely
now
that
you're ruining it. Thank you.
I'm kidding. But I mean, like, you know, maybe I'm wrong. I think it's just universal. Something about, ghost-shaped aliens is really what they are. They are aliens, but they do look like little ghosts, or how we would draw ghosts. And then they're scrounging those burgers. like it's just really funny to think that the aliens are just here just to enjoy burger cuisine, but for whatever reason have to be gunned down by federal agents. It's just really such a shame. It makes you despise when the rule actually says something like have as many, aliens captured as possible. You're like, well, no, man, free them. They just want burger.
Yeah, when I see games that have like a huge exposition piece before the rule book, and it's all about like the land of,
Generia.
Yeah, the land of Generia was overtaken by the darkness, and then you like compare it to something like Nine Tails Panic.
There's no story.
Rules. There's like no story, but somehow it's more evocative of theme and has more personality than this giant, massive thing that talks about how much theme and how much story it has. I'm not disparaging the big Generia game. I just have to give credit where credit's due to Oink Games for just infusing so much personality into their tiny little boxes.
100 games to play before you die.
Game number 4 is Monikers from 2015. This is designed by Alex Hague and Justin Vickers of CMYK Games. This game has many names. I picked the Monikers one because I think it's valuable to also showcase CMYK as a publisher because they have a very distinct and charming style. However, others may know this game as Time's Up. Some might know it as Celebrities. This might even be familiar to some of the games on Jackbox. There's a lot of incarnations of this. The first time I played it was a game called Crazy Bowl. And this is just you had a bowl, a kitchen bowl, and then you put pieces of paper in, kind of like charades. But at its core, this is the quintessential two teams are working against each other or are working to try and get their team to guess something. This is the stand-in for that quote-unquote genre on the list of games before you die. You are given different monikers that you have to guess, essentially, or have your team guess. There'll be something like Gangnam Style, for example. Depending on what expansion you have, they can get pretty abstract. Then you have to get your team to guess what it is by not saying explicitly what it is. So kind of like the game Taboo. The catch, the gimmick, is that afterwards, you repeat the entire process with the same hints, but this time you can only give one word as a clue and you're stuck with that word. And then in the third round, you have to do charades. You can only offer gestures and can't say anything. So on one hand, it's getting harder and harder to communicate what you're trying to get across. But on the other hand, everybody already knows the words that are in the collective pool that could potentially be this particular moniker. And so the game simultaneously gets harder and easier. More important than anything, and this is the case with a lot of the party games that we've talked about in this particular section, this is a game that makes you laugh. It's just downright silly, especially when people have like the dumbest hint for something, but somehow it sticks. Those things become inside jokes that permeate from game to game and kind of like pop up in different times when we're talking about funny things that happened in the past.
It's great. Like if I could only pick one party game that everybody ought to play, if I could only pick one game to replace all future sessions of Cards Against Humanity that might ever occur in a person's life, it would probably be this. It seems innocuous at first, but it can genuinely create like permanent, long-lasting memes within your friend group, especially if you have at least one person out there that is going to just throw in something genuinely esoteric or highly specific to them because they know that, eventually people are going to be able to put the words together in the first round, and then it's going to get more and more abstract to call back to that card. Just genuine like meme generator, the game, without any of the arbitrary corporate forcedness of meme generation, if you know what I mean.
That was Monikers, again, by CMYK Games.
All right. Kenny, I think it's time we stop fucking wasting time. Quit the yapping. I think it's time we get serious.
Yeah, we're being playful about it, but we're going to be talking about something that is, I would say, a little bit more serious than some of the other topics we've talked about. And so with that, I think we wanted to do a few disclaimers. This is going to involve socio-political conversation, I would say considerably more than other topics that we've covered in the past. If that's not your jam, I guess just heads up. And I recognize that this is an entertainment podcast at the end of the day. But with that being said, I think that any form of entertainment is inherently going to be political. Even just abstaining from talking about these things is making a statement in and of itself.
But at the end of the day, like, you and I were just like two guys. We didn't study this in school. We're not trying to be politicians or whatever, I guess, qualifications necessitate this conversation. You know, we're 1.5 white guys, but we have some ideas on what's going on with this and some things we want to highlight, some of the successes I think we'd like to talk about. And then very much, like you said, if we basically sat silently on this topic forever, I think that would be a kind of a statement in itself, that we think that by trying to remain, quote unquote, apolitical, we're accepting a certain status quo. And I think that the board gaming hobby has a steep hurdle that it's trying to overcome in terms of inclusivity and making various people feel welcome in this community.
Okay, so board game glow-ups. We're going to talk about specific games that have had second editions or reprints that have either changed or not changed anything mechanically, but have definitely gone and applied thematic differences to the original. And that's because, for the most part, there being a socio-political reason that they have made these changes. And so we want to just highlight what those changes are and then give our takes as far as how we feel about the changes. So we talked about games we played. Puerto Rico got a reprint called Puerto Rico 1897, which now Awakened Realms has a Kickstarter for. Puerto Rico is a game about colonialism, first of all, and that could be a topic in and of itself. But on top of that, Puerto Rico, the workers that you place to produce goods on your different buildings are called colonists. However, they come off of a boat and then they are small brown circles and you don't have to pay or feed them any sort of upkeep. A lot of people have talked about the problems with Puerto Rico. Even though it never explicitly states that these colonists are slaves, it's implied that these are slaves that you are owning and exploiting to generate the income and the resources. What the Puerto Rico 1897 version does is, first of all, positions Puerto Rico in the singular year that it purely had its own independence. Unfortunately, the years prior to 1897, it was still a colony. And then after 1897, it was technically not a colony anymore, but it was inhabited by the Americans and has been like that since. The second thing that it does is that it shifts the colonists from being these folks that come off of ships to being the folks that encourage the industries in Puerto Rico. They are local citizens. They have their independence. That's very clearly, represented both mechanically and thematically as far as what's in the game. There's also the depictions of local Puerto Ricans on the boards, on the art in the game. And then lastly, the last major change in Puerto Rico 1897 is that the industries that you're generating are more based around tourism as opposed to plantations and things like that, because it takes place in a different time.
This is kind of where like my blind spots are showing, because I don't know that much about the history or the like struggle for independence that Puerto Rico has faced or is likely still facing to this day. It is functionally still a colony of the United States. It's bizarre to me that it continues to be treated as a like non-state entity. I think it's kind of interesting that in the first place, a non-Puerto Rican designer came up with the original game. I mean, this is a German designer. I don't think it's impossible for Europeans of a colonial lineage to be able to tell these stories and work with people whose culture that they are trying to infuse into these games. I think it's possible to do it right, to do it in a way that's collaborative and is going to highlight the culture that was something they missed in 1998 by a mile and a half.
On the topic of cultural consultants, so I'm half Japanese. I have played a lot of games that are about Japan, and some represent Japanese culture better than others. I would say with a resounding confidence that the games that either had a cultural consultant or that were made by folks that are heavily familiar with Japanese culture tend to fire much better off with me than games that didn't do the research. I'm not a proponent of you have to be Japanese to make a Japanese game. However, it really rubs me the wrong way when I play a game about feudal Japan and all they're talking about is honor points and loyalty, and then all of a sudden there's a panda and there's a dragon, and it just feels like there's a general flavor of Orientalism in the game. That just reeks of not having done research. Ideally, hire a consultant if you are not of the culture. At a minimum, do your research. Don't just pick a theme because it sounds cool to you, because nowadays that just doesn't fly. Folks are more vocal about when these things bother them. And the reality is they do bother them, because I'm sure we have some listeners who are maybe dealing with the cognitive dissonance of like, well, do people actually care about this? Are there people complaining about this? And the answer is yes. A fair number of people take offense when their cultures are misrepresented.
And I mean, I think it can be a little hard for Americans to fully appreciate deprecation of their culture in games. You've never really had to face that experience, I feel like. You've never been sort of like the cultural joke in a game. And if you were, it's because it was like an American satirizing America itself, like 90% of the time. I can't even think of an instance where like a European made like this purposefully satiric like amalgam of American culture, but also tried to base it in some sort of like historical reality for Americans. But like, you know, the only thing your characters eat are burgers or something like that. Just no analog like this seems to exist. Perhaps publishers would just think it's like so transparently stupid or simple.
Well, they would just think it's not marketable.
Yeah, and that they can't market it. Exactly, because it's like, unless it's being explicitly satirical, it's not going to go anywhere. But when it comes to other cultures like Asia, Africa, Latin America, it's really easy to get away with all that shit because no one's doing the checking, or at least no one used to, especially in the early 2000s with this culture, because it was just inundated from the top down with people that, it just wasn't even on their radar at best, or they actively had a racial superiority complex at worst.
So to go back to Puerto Rico, I'd say overall the changes are really good. And the reason they're good is because they brought in a cultural consultant. So Jason Perez, he has a very, very good YouTube channel called Shelf Stories that talks about critically approaching board gaming. He is of Puerto Rican descent. He raised a stink about Puerto Rico. He basically listed out the problems with it in a way that was very concise and aligned with a lot of the other problems that folks had expressed on Board Game Geek and other forums. And the designer, Andreas Seyfarth, they took note of what Jason had said and actually reached out to him. And from there, Jason proactively proposed what is now Puerto Rico 1897. In my research, I believe he was the person that came up with the actual name Puerto Rico 1897. He has a video detailing basically his vision for what this game would be like, which is very much what this version is that we're seeing nowadays. He was brought in as the official cultural consultant for the design and saw it from beginning to end. And as a result, we have something that feels truly attuned with what we would want out of a revised Puerto Rico. There is a twist, Tom. Hear the twist now?
Well, and I don't know the exact story very well, but something came up, right, where he wasn't credited in a way that he felt was due. Was that about it?
Yes. So Jason Perez published a video along the lines of that he felt tokenized, used, and discarded by the very game that was trying to approach the removing of tokenization as one of its aspects. Unfortunately, the video isn't up anymore, so all we have to reference are comments and discussions about it. There were mixed responses to it. My take on the overall thing is that Jason agreed to some not ideal terms as far as how he would be credited and how he would be compensated for his work on Puerto Rico 1897. He put a ton of work into it, and then he for good reason, felt like he had been used. I reached out to him to see if he'd be willing to talk to us about his experience and everything like that. But he said that unfortunately he's not willing to comment on the topic at this time. Jason, without knowing the full details, we just hope that your voice can continue to be heard. Again, Shelf Stories is the YouTube channel. He has some excellent topics that he covers. The one he did most recently, which was like a year ago, is about generative AI and, how it's used as far as like board gaming. But he has all kinds of really good topics, critical analysis of what it means to be a reviewer, things like that. So definitely recommend checking out his channel.
Yeah, I feel like his story echoes something that I think we've seen quite a bit in recent years. I think one of the most interesting periods in Magic's art design in particular was under the guide of Sue Ann Harkey. That's when they did the Jamura block with visions and all the stuff that takes place in a very notably African-inspired plane that they still haven't really even come back to, which is just kind of wild to think. And her art direction and sort of the attempts cut against the culture of Wizards of the Coast at the time. And notably, she was axed for it, I think. Not necessarily because she was ruining their boys club, or at least, no one maybe would admit to it now. But it seems like, at least for her, that very much was kind of the feeling that she got, that she just was disrupting the order of things a little too much. Yeah, my point is I feel like a lot of these companies have these ingrained structures just in place, and they really have to do the hard work, I think, of uprooting those problems from the bottom up. And I think very, very few of them are actually willing to do that. It's understandable to see why they wouldn't, but it's unfortunate and it's frustrating, and I think it leaves a lot of people like Jason in the lurch at the end of the day. They get hired on as contractors basically to, again, paint over the problems of this company's past, and then they get a little bit of credit on a couple pieces of paper that come with the game maybe. And it doesn't really show how much effort, how much passion and energy that person put in to fixing a very serious problem for a game like Puerto Rico.
Shall we talk about some other notable games, Tom? I'm going to group these ones together. Chinatown, it just has that general feeling of cultural insensitivity. Just a lot of stereotypes about industries owned by folks of Chinese descent in urban areas of the U.S. The game was republished as Waterfall Park, and now doesn't have any sort of culture associated. You're building a theme park with all kinds of different amusement concessions, things like that. Then there's Great Western Trail. It has some problematic depictions of Native Americans. I believe they're called Indians in the rule book. You have to get rid of them to make sure you continue along your path. The updated Great Western Trail 2nd edition replaces the quote-unquote Indians with your classic kind of outlaws, bandits, basically, that have the bandana in front of their mouth. On top of that, there's a little bit more representation. One thing that you read sometimes on the internet is, why are we trying to add representation to time periods that didn't have it? Well, first of all, that's wrong. There's a lot more diversity. Aside from that, I think representation is important abstracted from historical significance, because it allows people that are often marginalized in board game communities to experience the game in a way that feels more comfortable to them. One thing that was really significant for me when I had my daughter is she would be watching a TV show and be like, oh, I'm like that character because that character is a girl. It had always been something that I understood at an abstracted level, but didn't feel personally attached to, that all of a sudden clicked and made sense for me. If you are a minority and you see somebody that represents you in a game, not only are you going to feel like you exist in the space, but on top of that, you're going to be more willing to play that game. I hear people huff and puff about representation not being accurate. Just consider for a moment what you're saying. You're saying that you'd rather the game be as accurate as possible with regard to the specific point then allow people to feel comfortable playing the game. If we're going to take that perspective a little bit further, consider all the things that you're willing to concede about the game already that are either A, inaccurate, or B, abstract away certain ideas to make the game functional.
And a game that had a similar issue was Five Tribes, right? When it was originally published, I believe cards that are today called fakirs were called slaves. And using the slave cards as a kind of commodity that you could exchange for other things in the game was part of it. And the defense at the time was something like, oh, it's just historical accuracy. It's like true to the period or whatever. Motherfucker, you made a fucking Mancala game, okay? Like, this is not a John Company or like a Votes for Women, like a game that is the game has fucking genies in it, like literal genies. And they made like a good effort to put like these are folk characters from, real folklore. And then but then like you're putting slaves in the game. It seemed so arbitrary, even if it is like true to the time period or whatever. But just the idea that like people have to pick up, pass around, and deal out slave cards is like an uncomfortable feeling pretty much no matter what context you're in. And I think, obviously they learned that lesson pretty much the hard way. Like, really take a step back and think about, like, am I making an important, like, political statement? Am I addressing the racial problems of this time period with what I am doing? Or am I just kind of being lazy in a way? And I think that for Five Tribes, it was the latter. In that case, there wasn't a true need to have it be depicted as slaves on these cards.
To be clear, before people add us in the comments, Five Tribes, the first edition, did have a comment about the slavery in the rule book that basically was along the lines of, well, we acknowledge that this is a problem, but we're trying to historically represent it. What Tom's saying is that the type of game matters. Like, to bring back John Company, we had an argument about this recently. The whole point of John Company is that you're being a shithead. So the fact that you're representing these awful people from history, that makes sense because it's a historical consim, first of all. And on top of that, you are supposed to be bad. You are a bad person. In Five Tribes, there's no implication that the slavery is negative other than the brief paragraph that's included in the rule book. Other than that, you're just having a fun time doing the fun Euro stuff. I'm not opposed to representing things like slavery in a game. I just don't like when it's represented in a either neutral or fun way.
So far, broadly, we've talked about games that, they have like these problematic elements and they're kind of like transparent to the end users. What we often don't talk about, or I feel like what these conversations tend to eclipse, are conversations about what types of games are really even being made in the first place. Do you know why, Kenny, there's such a relationship between board gaming and railroads, for example?
I do not. Why?
Well, I was reading this great book. It's called The Privilege of Play. For the record, I haven't finished it. That book highlights how the history of the model railroad clubs in these elite schools informed geek culture broadly. It was the guys who were trying to figure out the circuit boards and the switches and the electricity of these railroads that basically went on to invent like the computers. And it was like the computer geeks that were creating like clubs where they could do role-playing games, and that turns into like TSR and Wizards of the Coast, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a lot of geek culture in these hobbies are steeped in these early model railroad clubs. That has carried into the types of games that get made today. So whenever you think of like the words empire or republic or civilization, a lot of the times the games that do those things are highlighting, more often than not, a European world. Think Mosaic, something we actually played pretty recently. There's like a sliver of Africa in that game, and the rest of it is Europe. You just kind of see this over and over again. It's like there's all these games about like imperialism, these 4X games where you're exploring, exploiting, expanding. the very culture, the very background of the game is built on this idea that like we have a civilization that is worth expanding, needs to control the natural resources of the world around it, and needs to harvest those resources and turn it into something better. It's still just happening all the time. And I mean, some of the games I'm describing are pretty fun, and it's worth wondering, why aren't these same games could be based in the world of ancient Africa? We just take for granted the idea that like Roman columns and republics and these systems of government that we had in the European world are just kind of like the de facto backdrop for these things.
I think it's important to recognize folks that are making these efforts. The only one I can think of with regards to this topic that you're talking about, Tom, is Imperium Classics and then Imperium Horizons, which was the follow-up. So this is a deck building game where you take on a different civilization each game. First of all, it's got civilizations that I've never seen in games before that I didn't even know about until I played it. But on top of that, each deck aims to really showcase what are the important events, what are the important leaders that are associated with that particular civilization. So if you are looking for something that's more along the lines of what Tom's talking about, definitely recommend checking out Imperium Classics and Imperium Horizons. I want to briefly mention Pax Pamir. Love the game. The first edition was co-designed by a very problematic individual who insisted on including a document that was called In Defense of Colonialism. Since then, Cole Worley was able to get the rights exclusively, and in Pax Pamir 2nd Edition created what was his original vision for the game, which is very much a game that respects and tries to represent the historics of the great game. Kudos to Cole for that. There's also the latest version of Food Chain Magnet. This one I'm a little bit scratching my head around because I thought that the game always was kind of a satire of the media that it was representing. So I was kind of okay with it just representing your Johnny Rocket styled fast food place in the oldies times.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what we said earlier. It's like when we allow people to be able to see themselves in games, they're more likely to want to approach it. The original game, notably with Food Chain Magnet, it only depicts white people. There is just no person of color on any card in that game. So they reskinned it now, at least with a more diverse cast of cards. I don't know. It is interesting that it originally seemed like it was parodying the capitalist culture and the systems that it thrives in, and now to repackage the game in a like more diverse way, it's kind of like, okay, great. Like now you can experience worker exploitation and the labor theory of value, except some of your wait staff are black. Like, it's kind of like, what's the point? It's such an abstract game in the first place. I don't think it loses anything by going in this direction fundamentally. Also, broadly, if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're like, these idiots don't know what the hell they are talking about. I have a master's degree in this. I've spent so much time reading like 100,000 books. They're not even hitting on any of these solid points that I'd love to talk about. We'd love to have you on, honestly. So reach out to us. How can they reach out to us, Kenny?
They can reach us at shelfstablecast@gmail.com.
I think that's going to do it for now. There's only so long we can go. Thank you so much to everybody for listening. Tell us if you liked it, if you hated it, if you felt like we should do more of this type of topic. We think these things need spoken about, need brought up more regularly. I'd like to say thank you especially to Michael, Tyler, Devon, and Josh of the Boise RainBeaus. And thank you especially to Bonehouse for letting us use their song Rot as our opening theme song.
Tom, what do you want to do for next topic?
Let's talk about the Spiel des Jahres, maybe.
Oh, yeah.